You are protecting the furniture from impact, but you are not protecting it from its own weight. Leah Morgan's voice crossed the private conference room just as Calvin Brooks reached for the approval folder. On the screen behind him, a line of damaged stone tables, cracked cabinet frames, and shattered decorative panels filled the wall. Beneath the images, the annual loss estimate glowed in white numbers: $36 million. Preston Vale, the vice president of distribution, turned from the presentation and looked toward the coffee station. Leah stood beside a polished silver cart, one hand resting near the handle of the coffee pot. Her black hotel uniform was neat, her white blouse crisp beneath the soft lighting of the Rainier Crown Hotel. In front of her sat two porcelain cups. One rested low on a folded napkin. The other stood higher on two sugar packets. "We asked for coffee," Preston said. "Not a structural analysis." A few executives smiled. Leah did not. She placed one finger against the edge of the table and pushed lightly. The cup on the folded napkin barely moved. The cup raised on the sugar packets tilted, trembled, then settled at an angle. Calvin stopped turning the pen between his fingers. He was 57, silver-haired, composed, and accustomed to rooms becoming quieter when he looked up. He studied the cups, then the damaged photographs. Every fracture seemed to run below the upper support straps, close to the same diagonal line. "Explain that," he said. Preston stepped forward. "Calvin, this is a stage comparison. The transportation system involves road vibration, loading conditions, driver behavior, and product variation." "Exactly," Leah said. "And all of those forces travel through the point where the load is held." Preston stared at her. "What is your name?" "Leah Morgan." "Leah, the company has spent 8 months reviewing driver reports, insurance claims, warehouse procedures, and packaging materials. This is not a coffee table problem." She looked at the screen. "Then why do different products keep failing in the same place?" The room lost its small smiles. Calvin turned toward the largest photograph, a stone dining table photographed inside a delivery truck. 2 straps crossed the upper frame. The heaviest section rested nearly 18 inches below them. A crack ran upward from the lower corner toward the point where the frame was restrained. "How long have you been looking at these?" he asked. "Since the meeting began. And you believe the support position is causing $36 million in losses?" "I believe it is one reason the damage follows the same pattern. You are holding the furniture high and allowing the heaviest part to move below the restraint. The truck does not need to hit anything. Normal turns, stops, and vibration can make the lower weight twist against the fixed point." Preston gave a controlled laugh. "Now ordinary highway movement is destroying premium furniture." Leah moved the raised cup slightly. It leaned again. "Thousands of small movements can do more damage than one dramatic event, especially when the force repeats at the same weak point." Dana Mercer, the director of logistics operations, leaned closer to the screen. Miles Carter, who managed the Western Distribution Center, stopped writing and studied the photographs as though seeing them for the first time. Calvin noticed. "Dana." She hesitated. "Damage did increase after we changed the shipping frames last year." Preston answered before she could continue. "The frames passed vendor testing and reduced packaging costs." Leah looked at the narrow base shown in one of the photographs. "Did the testing use fully loaded trucks over normal delivery routes?" Preston's expression tightened. "That information is confidential." Jonathan Reed, Calvin's legal counsel, closed the folder in front of him. "That is not an answer." Calvin placed the approval pen on the table. The proposal beside it requested $18 million for higher insurance coverage, additional drivers, and thicker padding. Until that moment, everyone in the room had treated the plan as the cost of protecting the business. Now it looked like a price placed over a question no one had answered. Preston folded his arms. "A cup and 2 sugar packets do not replace engineering data." "No," Leah said. "They show you where to look." Calvin watched her for a long moment. "Can you prove it?" Leah looked at the damaged table on the screen, then at the cup still leaning above the folded napkin. "Give me the loading photographs, the frame specifications, the route records, and one controlled test." "How much time?" "Enough to compare what changed with where the damage began." Preston shook his head. "This is a hotel waitress standing in the middle of a distribution meeting." Calvin did not look at him. "You have 3 minutes to tell me why every crack follows the same angle." Leah lifted the coffee pot, filled Calvin's cup, and set it beside the unsigned $18 million proposal. Because the company keeps adding protection around the product, she said, while the structure beneath it is holding the weight in the wrong place. 40 hours earlier, she had entered the same room carrying coffee, unaware that a set of delivery photographs would reopen the part of her life she had stopped explaining to anyone. 40 hours earlier, the private conference room at the Rainier Crown Hotel had been arranged for an emergency meeting before sunrise. Leah Morgan entered with a silver coffee service while rain moved in thin lines across the windows overlooking downtown Seattle. On the screen, a map of the western United States glowed with red markers showing damaged deliveries from Washington to Arizona. Preston Vale stood beside it with a remote in one hand and a stack of insurance reports in the other. Calvin Brooks sat at the head of the table, silent, while Dana Mercer, Miles Carter, Jonathan Reed, and several regional managers opened their folders. The losses are accelerating, Preston said. $36 million over the last 12 months, with the Western region responsible for more than half. Leah placed coffee beside Calvin, then moved toward the other guests. The first photographs showed cracked stone tabletops, cabinet frames pulled out of alignment, and decorative panels rejected at delivery. Preston changed the slide before anyone studied them for long. The pattern is clear, he continued. Drivers are taking turns too sharply, warehouse crews are rushing the loading process, and customers are reporting cosmetic damage as structural failure. Miles looked up. Several of those drivers have clean records. Preston did not pause. Clean records do not prevent careless handling. Dana opened a spreadsheet. We also found damage on short routes with experienced crews, which suggests inconsistent warehouse procedures, Preston said. That is why we need stronger penalties at the distribution level. He presented the proposed response: additional driver monitoring, higher insurance coverage, thicker foam, more warehouse inspections, and financial deductions for centers with repeated claims. Calvin glanced at the total. $18 million. Will it solve the problem? He asked. It will reduce exposure, Preston replied. That was not the same answer, and Leah noticed Calvin's expression change slightly. She continued around the table, filling cups while the presentation returned to the damaged photographs. Different products, different routes, different drivers. Yet the fractures seemed strangely similar. Leah slowed near the screen. On a stone console table, the main crack began below the upper strap and traveled upward at an angle. On a cabinet frame, the separation appeared at nearly the same height. On a decorative panel, the stress mark began below the support point again. She counted the distance using the visible frame measurements. Approximately 18 inches. Preston changed the slide. Leah kept looking at the empty screen as though the images were still there. More coffee, one executive said without turning toward her. She filled his cup. Preston blamed rough roads, sudden stops, and poor stacking discipline. Dana raised a hand. The increase began after the Western Centers adopted the new shipping frame. Preston clicked to a cost chart. The frame reduced packaging expense and assembly time. Vendor testing showed acceptable performance. What kind of testing? Miles asked. Standard transportation simulation. Leah placed a fresh cup beside Dana. The photograph at the bottom of Dana's report showed the frame more clearly. It held each product high across the upper section, while the heaviest mass rested below the main restraint with little support beneath it. Leah felt an old habit return. She pictured the product not as furniture, but as weight responding to motion. A truck turned. The upper section stayed fixed. The lower section continued moving. The frame did not allow the product to fall, but it gave the weight room to twist. Preston moved to the final slide. The company cannot control every mile of road. It can control insurance, staffing, and compliance. Calvin looked at the claims total again. And if the cause is the frame? Preston's expression remained smooth. We have no evidence of that. Leah looked once more at the diagonal fractures, each one beginning below the same support point. She had not seen the route records, the frame specifications, or the vibration data. She had only seen enough to know that the photographs were not random. Charles Wynn, the hotel conference manager, stepped beside her near the service station. Keep the coffee moving, he whispered. Leah nodded. She returned to Calvin's end of the table and replaced his cooling cup. He did not look at her. No one asked what she had noticed. The meeting ended with Preston promising a final recommendation within 2 days. As the executives left, Leah collected the empty cups and found Dana's discarded printout beneath a chair. The image of the damaged stone table remained on the last page. Leah studied the upper strap, then the crack below it. In the margin, she wrote one quiet question before placing the report back on the table. Why is the support above the center of gravity? Leah Morgan had spent 7 years designing systems for objects that could not afford to fail in transit. Before the black hotel uniform, before the silver coffee cart, before anyone knew her only as the woman who remembered how each guest took their coffee, she had worked in protective packaging engineering for a company outside Tacoma. Her projects included laboratory equipment, custom stone furniture, museum display cases, and precision instruments shipped across thousands of miles. She learned early that expensive products rarely failed because of one dramatic event. Most damage began with small movement repeated over time. A loose corner shifted a fraction of an inch. A heavy base pulled against a rigid strap. A vibration returned again and again to the same weak point until the material finally showed what the numbers had missed. Leah could look at a fracture and often tell whether the problem came from impact, compression, twisting, or poor support. Her notebooks were filled with sketches of weight distribution, center of gravity, strap placement, and the quiet forces created by ordinary turns on ordinary roads. She preferred tests that copied real conditions. Smooth floors and perfect loads produced clean reports. Real routes produced useful answers. 5 years into her career, Leah led the redesign of a reusable transport frame for sensitive laboratory cabinets. The original system protected the top and corners, but left the lower weight unsupported. Damage claims had been blamed on drivers until Leah installed motion sensors and proved that normal highway vibration was creating repeated torsion below the main restraint. Moving the support point lower by 3 inches reduced damage by more than 60%. Her managers praised the result. Then the company was acquired. Departments were combined, design teams were reduced, and decisions moved to an office 3 states away. Leah stayed through the transition until her position disappeared beneath language about efficiency. The severance letter called it organizational alignment. The empty desk felt more honest. Around the same time, her father needed surgery and several months of help at home. Leah returned to Seattle, expecting the pause to be temporary. She drove him to appointments, organized medication schedules, and handled insurance forms while sending applications to companies that wanted recent management titles more than practical experience. The Rainier Crown Hotel offered stable hours, health coverage, and a schedule she could adjust around her father's recovery. Leah accepted the position without apology. She respected the work. Service required attention, timing, memory, and patience. It also placed her inside rooms where people revealed more than they intended because they assumed the person pouring coffee was not listening. Her father recovered slowly. Leah remained at the hotel after he no longer needed daily help. She told herself the job was temporary, but months became a year. Her engineering notebooks stayed in a drawer beside old design samples and a worn digital measuring tool. Only one small notebook remained in her purse. She still drew diagrams when she noticed how luggage carts shifted under uneven weight or how banquet equipment was stacked too high. She never showed the sketches to anyone. Experience had taught her that expertise without the correct title often sounded like interruption. Yet the damaged furniture photographs had reached the part of her mind that never stopped measuring. The diagonal cracks, the upper straps, the unsupported mass below them, the sudden increase after the new frame appeared. None of it felt random. That evening, after her shift ended, Leah sat alone in the employee break room and redrew the stone table from memory. She marked the strap location, the estimated center of gravity, and the fracture line. Then she drew the truck, taking a normal right turn. The upper frame remained fixed. The lower weight moved outward. The product twisted around the restraint like a long lever. Leah stared at the page. If the support point was where the photograph suggested, thicker foam would not solve the problem. More insurance would only pay for the same mistake more efficiently. She closed the notebook when Charles Wynn entered. "Still working?" he asked. Leah slipped the pen into her pocket. "Just thinking." Charles glanced at the notebook, but did not ask about it. By the time Leah left the hotel, rain had softened the city lights into long reflections across the pavement. She carried one question with her all the way home. How many people had blamed the drivers before anyone measured where the weight was actually being held? The next morning, the emergency meeting resumed in the same conference room. though the rain had cleared and pale sunlight now stretched across the windows. Leah Morgan entered with fresh coffee, while Dana Mercer reviewed updated damage reports at the far end of the table. Calvin Brooks sat beneath the screen with Jonathan Reed beside him. Preston Vale stood near the presentation controls, already speaking before everyone had taken a seat. "The recommendation remains unchanged," he said. "We increase insurance coverage, expand driver monitoring, and require stricter loading compliance at every Western distribution center." Dana opened a folder. "The timing still concerns me." The damage rate rose sharply after the new transport frames were introduced. Preston changed the slide. The frames reduced material expense and loading time. The vendor certification was acceptable. Acceptable under what conditions? Miles Carter asked. Preston ignored the question and moved to a chart comparing driver incidents. Leah placed a cup beside Calvin, then another beside Dana. The next image on the screen showed a stone console secured inside a truck. The main strap crossed the upper third of the frame. The heaviest section rested below it with no lower support. A crack ran upward from a corner almost exactly where Leah had drawn it in her notebook the night before. She slowed. Dana noticed. "Is something wrong?" she asked quietly. Leah kept her voice low. "Why is the support above the center of gravity?" Preston stopped mid-sentence. "Excuse me." Dana turned the photograph toward Leah. "She is asking about the restraint position." Preston looked at Leah's uniform, then at the coffee pot in her hand. "We asked you about coffee." The room fell still. Leah met his eyes. "The coffee is ready." The answer is still in the photograph. Preston gave a brief, controlled smile. "This discussion involves transportation engineering, insurance exposure, and national distribution policy." "Then the support point should matter," Leah said. "The frame holds the upper section, while the lower mass remains free to move. Every normal turn pulls the weight against the same fixed point." Calvin looked at the photograph again. "How far below the strap is the center of gravity?" Preston answered first. "That varies by product." "Then why are different products using the same frame?" Leah asked. Preston's expression tightened. "Because standardization reduces cost." Dana slid another photograph across the table. A cabinet frame showed separation at nearly the same height. Leah placed it beside the stone table image. "Different product. Same stress line." Miles opened a claims folder and found a decorative panel with a similar diagonal fracture. 3 images now formed a row. Different materials. Different routes. Different drivers. The same failure pattern. Calvin leaned forward. "When did the frame change?" Dana checked her report. 8 months ago." "When did the damage begin rising?" 7 months ago." Preston folded his arms. "Correlation does not prove cause." "No," Leah said. "But repeated damage below the same restraint point tells you where to test." Jonathan closed his legal pad. "Was the current frame tested under fully loaded road conditions?" Preston hesitated. "The vendor performed standard simulation." "That was not the question," Jonathan said. Calvin turned to Dana. "Do we have route photographs from before and after the change?" "Yes." "Frame specifications?" "Yes." "Driver records?" "Yes." Preston stepped closer to the table. "We are allowing an employee with no role in distribution to redirect a major review." Calvin looked at Leah. "Do you have experience in this field?" For the first time, the question was directed at her rather than around her. Leah set the coffee pot on the cart. 7 years in protective packaging and transport systems. The room changed. Not dramatically. No one apologized. But several people looked at her again, this time as if the uniform had stopped answering the question for them. Calvin glanced at the damaged photographs. "Why did you not mention that yesterday?" "No one asked what I knew." Preston looked away. Calvin pushed the approval folder aside. "Then I am asking now. Can you show us whether the frame is causing the damage?" Leah opened the small notebook she had carried in her purse. On the page was the same diagonal fracture, the same high restraint, and the same unsupported weight. "Not from photographs alone," she said. "But the pictures tell us where to begin." Calvin Brooks looked at Leah's notebook, then at the row of damaged product photographs. "Show us," he said. Preston Vale stepped forward. "Calvin, a conference table cannot reproduce a loaded truck." "No," Leah replied. "But it can reproduce the principle." She moved 2 porcelain coffee cups from the service cart to the center of the table. Beneath the first cup, she folded a cloth napkin into a low, wide support that held the base evenly. Beneath the second, She placed 2 sugar packets near the upper half, raising the cup while leaving most of its weight unsupported below the contact point. She laid a silver spoon beside them. Imagine the cup is a stone table packed vertically, she said. The top represents the section held by the strap. The base represents the heaviest part of the product. Preston looked toward the other executives. This is not an engineering test. Leah kept her attention on the cups. It is not supposed to be. It shows why the current test may be asking the wrong question. She pushed the table lightly with 2 fingers. The first cup shifted less than 1/4 of an inch and settled. The second tilted against the sugar packets before returning upright. Leah repeated the movement from the opposite direction. Again, the raised cup leaned around the narrow support. Calvin watched the lower edge rather than the rim. The strap keeps it from falling, he said. Yes, Leah answered. But preventing a fall is not the same as supporting the load. She placed the spoon vertically beside the second cup and held it near the top. When she moved the lower end from side to side, the spoon rotated around her fingers. The upper restraint becomes a pivot. The lower weight becomes a lever. A truck turns left, the weight continues right. The vehicle straightens, then the load returns. The movement may be small, but it happens thousands of times. Dana Mercer leaned closer. That would explain why the fractures begin below the strap. And why thicker foam has not stopped them, Leah said. Foam can soften contact. It cannot move the center of support. Miles Carter opened a shipping photograph on his tablet and enlarged the lower frame. The old rack had a crossbar here, he said, pointing near the product base. The new one does not. Preston's voice sharpened. The old rack was heavier, slower to assemble, and more expensive. How much more expensive? Calvin asked. We are discussing system performance, not one component price. How much? Preston paused. A few dollars per unit. Calvin's expression did not change, but Jonathan Reed began writing. Leah lowered the second cup from the sugar packets and placed it onto the folded napkin. Then she moved the table again. The cup stayed centered. A lower support does not need to hold every surface, she said. It needs to carry the weight close to where the load naturally balances. Preston pointed toward the damaged furniture. Different products have different centers of gravity. A single low frame will not fit everything. Then the frame should adjust, Leah said. A movable lower cradle, corner supports, and measured restraint points based on product type. Standardize the method, not the exact position. Dana looked at Miles. Our crews already classify products before loading. Then the categories exist, Leah continued. They only need to control support placement. Calvin touched the unsigned $18 million proposal. What would you need to test this? The old and new frame specifications. Loading photographs. Damage records by product type. Route and driver data. Then one normal delivery route using a lower adjustable support. A perfect route? Preston asked. No, Leah said. A normal one. Regular driver. Regular stops. Regular load. Calvin looked at the cups again. How soon? I can review the records today. A controlled route test depends on the distribution center. Miles answered before Preston could. We can prepare one tomorrow. Jonathan closed his notebook. Leah will need a confidentiality agreement before seeing internal data. Prepare it, Calvin said. Preston stared at him. You are delaying an $18 million decision because a waitress moved 2 coffee cups. Calvin turned the damaged photograph toward him. I am delaying it because no one in this room has explained why the same crack keeps appearing in the same place. He looked at Leah. 3 minutes ago, you were here to serve coffee. Now you have given us a testable cause. Leah returned the cups to the cart. A cause is only useful if the data supports it. Calvin pushed the approval folder away. Then let the data answer. Jonathan Reed prepared the confidentiality agreement before noon. It limited Leah Morgan's access to shipping records, frame specifications, route data, and warehouse photographs with all customer information removed. Leah read every page before signing. Calvin Brooks signed as the authorizing executive. Preston Vale added his initials last, pressing the pen harder than necessary. By 1 o'clock, Leah was seated in a small operations room at the Western Distribution Center with Dana Mercer and Miles Carter. The walls were covered with route maps, delivery schedules, and photographs taken at loading docks across 5 states. Leah began with the frame specifications. The older design used a lower steel crossbar and adjustable corner supports. The newer version was lighter, taller, and $4 cheaper per unit. It held products near the upper third, reduced assembly time, and used disposable foam blocks beneath the base. On paper, the change looked efficient. In the damaged photographs, it looked incomplete. Leah arranged the images by product type, then by route length. Short deliveries showed the same fracture patterns as long ones. Experienced drivers showed the same damage as newly hired drivers. Smooth interstate routes produced fewer claims, but the location of failure remained consistent. The road changes the amount of damage, Leah said. It does not change where the damage begins. Dana opened a file containing loading reports. Leah noticed that warehouse crews arranged products by size, placing the largest items first and filling the remaining space around them. That made the trucks easier to load, but delivery stops occurred in a different order. Crews often had to move several items to reach the first delivery. Each extra movement placed the same heavy products back against the same high restraint. Miles rubbed one hand across his forehead. "We have been measuring loading time," he said. "Not how many times the product gets handled after that." Leah wrote the number of touches beside each claim. The most damaged items were not always the heaviest. They were the ones moved most often. Then she found the disposal invoices. Thousands of foam blocks, corner guards, and frame inserts were discarded after a single trip. The returning trucks came back nearly empty. "Why are the frames not collected?" she asked. Miles pointed to the current design. "They collapse poorly. Once the product is removed, the pieces take too much floor space, so delivery teams dispose of them." Leah looked at a route diagram. A truck left Seattle full, made several stops, and returned with more than 80% of its cargo space unused. The company was paying for one-way packaging while already paying for the empty return trip. By mid-afternoon, the problem had widened beyond one support bar. The high frame created instability. The loading sequence increased handling. The disposable design wasted the return route. Leah opened her notebook and drew a new system. A low adjustable cradle would hold the product near its center of gravity. Reusable corner guards would protect changing shapes. Color-coded tags would identify delivery order before loading. Red for the last stop, blue for the middle, green for the first. Drivers would photograph each product at loading, delivery, and frame pickup. Collapsible supports would stack flat inside the returning truck. Dana studied the sketch. "You are changing the entire flow." "The damage is not happening in one department," Leah said. "The solution cannot belong to one department either." Preston entered near 4 o'clock and looked at the drawings spread across the table. "This is becoming far more expensive than moving one support point." Leah turned the cost sheet toward him. "The current system spends money in 4 places to protect a $4 saving." She listed the claims, replacement shipments, disposable materials, and extra warehouse labor. "A reusable frame costs more once and less many times." Preston picked up the sketch. "And if the drivers fail to return them?" "The frame is assigned to the route, not the driver," Leah said. "Pickup confirmation closes the delivery record." Calvin arrived a few minutes later with Jonathan. Leah showed him the 3 connected failures and the proposed loop. He listened without interrupting. "What is the smallest test that can prove this?" he asked. "One normal Seattle to Portland route," Leah said. "Mixed products. Regular crew. Existing truck. Half the load in the current frames, half in adjustable prototypes. We measure vibration, handling time, unload time, and condition at every stop." Preston crossed his arms. "That is not enough data for a national decision." "It is enough data for the next question," Leah replied. Calvin looked at Miles. "Can you build the prototypes?" "By tomorrow night," Dana added. "The route leaves at 6 the following morning." Calvin closed the old frame report. "Then we test what actually happens, not what the presentation says should happen." Leah looked at the empty return route diagram on the wall. For months, the company had blamed the people driving the trucks. The records suggested the trucks had been carrying a flawed system in both directions. The Seattle to Portland test began before sunrise with the ordinary complications Leah had requested. The truck carried stone tables, wooden cabinets, decorative panels, and 2 upholstered benches scheduled for 6 different stops. The driver was not a company trainer or a selected specialist. He was Marcus Hill, a regular route driver with 11 years of experience and no interest in becoming part of an executive demonstration. "I was told to drive normally," he said as Leah checked the first vibration sensor. "That is exactly what I need," she replied. Half the products used the current high frames. The other half rested in adjustable prototypes built by Miles Carter's team. Their lower cradles supported the heaviest sections, while movable corner guards held each shape without forcing every item into the same position. Colored tags showed delivery order. Green items would leave first. Blue items belonged to the middle stops. Red items would remain until Portland. Dana Mercer photographed every product before the doors closed. Preston Vale arrived 10 minutes before departure and examined the truck with visible doubt. 30 trips would produce a meaningful sample, he said. One trip produces an anecdote. Leah secured the final sensor. One trip tells us whether the design deserves 30. Calvin Brooks stood near the loading dock with Jonathan Reed. He looked at the mixed road conditions on the route map. City traffic, interstate curves, long grades, multiple stops, rain expected south of Olympia. Can anything be adjusted once the truck leaves? He asked. Only if something becomes unsafe, Leah said. Otherwise, we record what happens. The truck departed at 6. Leah, Dana, and Miles followed in a company vehicle while sensor readings transmitted to a tablet. The first hour looked uneventful. Both frame types remained within acceptable movement limits on smooth highway sections. Preston joined the monitoring call from Seattle and said the early data showed no meaningful difference. Leah did not answer. She watched the readings through a series of long curves. The products in the older frames began showing repeated rotational movement below the upper restraint. The motion was small, less than an inch in most cases, but it returned at nearly every turn. The prototype frames showed shorter movement and faster recovery. At the first stop, the delivery crew opened the truck. Because the green tag products were positioned near the door, only 2 items had to be handled. On a normal route, crews often moved 5 or 6 pieces to reach the first delivery. Marcus checked his watch. 9 minutes faster than usual, he said. Dana documented the time. No one celebrated. The route continued. Rain began near Centralia. At the third stop, a cabinet in the current frame showed a slight separation near the lower corner. The matching cabinet in the prototype remained aligned. Preston's voice came through the tablet. That could be a manufacturing variation. It could, Leah said. Record it without deciding. By the 5th stop, the pattern had repeated across product types. The older frames allowed more twisting below the straps. The prototypes reduced rotational movement, lowered unloading time, and required fewer product touches because the color sequence matched the route. In Portland, the final stone table was removed from a current frame. A thin stress line had appeared below the upper restraint. The table in the adjustable cradle showed no visible change. Calvin had flown ahead and stood beside the dock when Leah reviewed the sensor data. How much better? He asked. On this route, average rotational movement dropped by 74%. Handling time fell by 22%. None of the prototype-supported products showed structural changes. Preston looked at the small sample summary. One route cannot justify replacing a national system. Agreed, Leah said. That is why the next test should be 30 routes, not why this one should be ignored. Calvin studied the returning truck. The prototype supports had collapsed flat and were stacked against one wall, leaving most of the cargo space empty. And those go back to Seattle? Yes, Leah said. The current packaging would be discarded here. Marcus closed the truck doors. The color tags helped more than I expected, he said. We stopped moving the same pieces at every delivery. Preston looked toward Calvin. The cost model still matters. Leah handed Calvin a page showing the projected reuse cycle. It matters more now. The prototypes cost more on the first trip and less by the 5th. After that, every reuse reduces the difference. Calvin looked at the stress line on the old frame table, then at the intact table beside it. Run 30 routes, he said. Different drivers. Different loads. No special conditions. Leah nodded. And include the difficult routes. Preston frowned. Why choose the routes most likely to fail? Leah looked at him calmly. Because a test that cannot fail cannot teach us anything. The 30-route trial lasted 3 weeks and covered rain, mountain grades, city traffic, long interstate stretches, and delivery schedules that changed without warning. Different drivers carried different loads through Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Northern California. No route received special treatment. Each truck used both frame systems, and each product was photographed at loading, delivery, and frame return. By the end of the trial, the pattern was no longer difficult to see. Damage in the adjustable prototypes fell by more than 70%. Unloading time improved because the color sequence matched the delivery order. Reusable supports returned on nearly empty trucks and were prepared for another trip instead of entering disposal bins. The current frames continued producing the same diagonal stress marks below the upper restraint. Calvin Brooks reviewed the summary in the Rainier Crown conference room, while Leah Morgan, Dana Mercer, Miles Carter, Jonathan Reed, and Preston Vale sat around the long table. No coffee demonstration was needed now. The evidence covered the screen. "What is the projected annual impact?" Calvin asked. Dana answered, "If the results hold across the Western network, more than $20 million in avoided claims, replacement shipments, packaging waste, and warehouse labor." Preston leaned forward. "That projection assumes full compliance and perfect frame recovery." Leah looked at him. "No, it assumes ordinary compliance based on the trial. We already included lost frames, delayed returns, and maintenance." Jonathan opened a separate folder. "There is another issue." He displayed the purchasing history for the current frame. 8 months earlier, Preston had approved the lighter design after a vendor promised a $4 reduction per unit and faster assembly. The savings appeared in his department's quarterly report. The damage claims appeared elsewhere. Insurance costs went to risk management. Replacement shipping went to distribution. Warehouse labor went to operations. Customer credits went to sales. No single report showed the full loss. Dana raised a support concern before approval, Jonathan said. He placed an email on the screen. Her message warned that the higher restraint point could increase movement below the strap. Preston had replied that the vendor certification was sufficient. In the final executive summary, her warning had been moved to an appendix and reduced to a note about future monitoring. Calvin read the exchange twice. "You knew the design changed the load position." Preston kept his voice measured. "I knew there was a theoretical concern. The cost savings were immediate. The risk was unproven." "The warning was not removed because it was false," Leah said. "It was removed because it complicated the savings." Preston turned toward her. "You are interpreting decisions made before you had access to the project." "I am reading the record." Jonathan continued. The $4 reduction had saved less than $1 million during the first year. The resulting losses had reached $36 million. Preston looked at Calvin. "Every executive decision involves trade-offs." Calvin closed the purchasing file. "A trade-off requires both sides to be visible." The room became quiet. For years, Brooks Living had rewarded departments for lowering the costs they could see while transferring consequences to departments they did not measure. Preston had not created that structure alone, but he had used it. He had protected a small success by separating it from a much larger failure. Calvin looked at Dana. "Why did your warning stop at the appendix?" She hesitated. "Because final approval belonged to distribution, and the reporting system did not require cross-department sign-off." Miles added, "Warehouse teams saw the new damage pattern, but claims were reviewed somewhere else." Leah looked at the screen where the costs appeared in separate columns. The company had all the information. It was divided so carefully that no one had to see the whole result. Calvin removed the unsigned $18 million proposal from the table. "We are not buying more insurance to protect a flawed system." He turned to Jonathan. "Begin a formal review of the frame decision and the reporting process." Preston's expression remained controlled, but the certainty had left it. Calvin continued. "Your authority over packaging and distribution changes is suspended pending that review." Then he looked at Leah. "Prepare a controlled rollout for 12 centers, with independent measurement and a full cost report across every department." Leah nodded. "Include warehouse staff, drivers, delivery teams, finance, and customer service." "Why customer service?" Calvin asked. "Because they hear the damage before the spreadsheets do." He looked at the 30-route report, then at the first photograph of the cracked stone table. The company had nearly spent $18 million treating the symptoms of a decision made to save $4. The solution had not appeared because someone invented new data. It appeared because one person finally connected the data everyone else had learned to keep apart. 6 months later, the new transport system was operating across 12 Brooks Living distribution centers. The adjustable frames returned on trucks that had once traveled back almost empty. Warehouse teams used color-coded delivery sequences before loading. Drivers photographed each handoff. Customer service reports were connected directly to packaging reviews instead of disappearing into a separate department. The results were steady enough to survive ordinary problems. Frames were sometimes returned late. A few supports needed repair. Some routes required different cradle positions for unusual products. None of those issues weakened the larger pattern. Damage claims fell by more than 68% across the expanded network. Replacement shipments dropped. Warehouse handling time improved. Packaging waste decreased because the same supports could be used again. The annual savings were projected to exceed $21 million, even after maintenance, training, and frame replacement costs were included. The number impressed the board. Leah Morgan cared more about the photographs. The same stone tables that had once arrived with diagonal stress lines now reached customers without visible damage. Delivery crews no longer moved the same cabinet 3 times to reach the first stop. Drivers who had been blamed for months were finally shown reports proving that the route had never been the only problem. Preston Vale left his position after the internal review found that he had repeatedly separated cost reductions from the losses they created. Dana Mercer was given authority to pause any packaging change that lacked cross-department approval. Miles Carter led the rollout team and required warehouse employees to test every new frame before a vendor received a national order. Calvin Brooks offered Leah a permanent leadership role only after her engineering history, previous designs, and professional references were independently verified. The title was Director of Transport Systems Design. Leah read the offer in the same Rainier Crown conference room where she had once stood beside the coffee cart. "There is one condition," she said. Calvin placed his pen on the table. "Yours or mine?" "Mine." She turned to the approval policy attached to the contract. No packaging decision should be approved by purchasing alone. Every change needs review from someone who loads the product, someone who drives it, someone who delivers it, and someone who measures the total cost. Calvin studied the list. That will slow decisions. It will slow the wrong decisions. He signed the policy before signing her appointment. At the first meeting under the new system, the chairs around the table looked different. A warehouse associate sat beside a financial analyst. A driver reviewed route conditions with a product designer. A customer service representative placed complaint photographs next to the quarterly cost report. No one was invited merely to observe. Each person had the authority to ask what another department might be missing. A porcelain coffee cup rested near Calvin's folder. Beside it lay the folded napkin Leah had used during the original demonstration. He looked at the cup, then toward Leah. "I was about to ask for coffee," he said. "You still can." He smiled slightly. "What are we not seeing?" Leah opened the new frame report and pointed to a rise in minor scratches at one center. The room leaned closer instead of looking away. Outside the windows, Seattle rain traced soft lines across the glass. Inside, the company was learning that listening early cost far less than repairing certainty later. What stayed with you most? Leah recognizing the hidden pattern, Calvin choosing to test an uncomfortable answer, or the realization that a $4 saving had created losses measured in millions. Share your thoughts, and subscribe if you believe quiet intelligence, dignity, and practical truth deserve to be heard. Sometimes a solution worth millions begins with one person noticing what everyone else has learned not to see.